it's a pleasure for me to be able to be here with you over these 3 lunchtimes, dealing with 3 different questions I've been asked to address. Obviously this one about the question about pleasure, and if you dial God into your life, does that mean that pleasure somehow gets dialed out? Tomorrow, this whole question about why would a loving God also be a God who passes judgment and act in that kind of way. And then obviously the last one on is Jesus claiming some kind of exclusive truth. And what ties all of these 3 questions together, if you like, is a sort of a moral knot. There is a moral dimension to each one of these questions, which either gives us cause for concern about considering the Christian faith, or, as I would like to say, once properly understood, actually is something that really endears it towards us. And this question about how we understand our own pursuit and pleasure is one that I can very strongly identify with myself. I wasn't raised in a Christian home, or even indeed in a Christian culture, because I was raised in the Middle East, in an Islamic culture and setting. And I can remember I didn't get to meet Christians, or get to know any people who were Christian for almost in my entire childhood and teenage life. And so it was only a little bit later that when I got to meet some Christians and got talking with them, I began considering what they had to say. And after about a 9-month process, I came to a point where I came to the conclusion that the Christian faith was actually true. Now the trouble is that made me feel desperately unhappy, because I didn't actually want the Christian faith to be true. I was very suspicious about Christians. I felt that they had absolutely nothing, but for some reason they wanted to share it with me. And my life at that point felt relatively together and secure. I don't normally like using the numbers, but I guess if you were to ask me back then, out of 10, how well do you think life is going, I might have said, well, it's probably an 8, maybe even 9 out of 10. Everything seemed to be going well. And the idea of becoming a Christian, to me, sort of felt like dropping from an 8 to a 1. In other words, life would be materially worse for me as a Christian rather than as a non-Christian. I didn't particularly believe in anything at that point. So it really felt that things were going to drop. Now, part of my reasoning then was I was fairly certain that my own pleasure was wrapped up in my own desire for fulfillment. But the terms which I was using to try to understand that own particular question, as I look back, I am sure are faulty. Because there was a strong part of me that was confusing the idea of being physically intimate with other people and actually having relational intimacy. And certainly at that stage in my life, I can remember I could even put a name to the person whom I felt I might have to give up if I were to become a Christian, because I was fairly certain, even though I had no experience of the Christian faith and no exposure to it, that if I did become a Christian, and that this God really did exist, he may have things to say about other things I wanted to do, which included my desire to sleep with a few people that I'd identified, and I was fairly certain he was going to put a stop to it, and hence my conviction that my life would be worse off, it would be emptier, it would be less fulfilling, there would be less pleasure and happiness as a result of becoming a Christian. But as I said, that analysis, I think, stems from this very faulty dilemma that was in my own heart and mind, between the fact that you can be very physically intimate with any number of people and yet still be empty. Because there is a difference between intimacy at a relational level and being intimate at a physical. Now, all of us at one level pursue things which we think will make us happy. I follow the graffiti artist Banksy on Twitter. He has 1.3 million followers, and he follows no one. As far as I'm aware, he's the only person that I follow on Twitter who follows no one else, 0. And yesterday, what he pushed up on his Twitter feed was this: there are 2 things we constantly confuse. And there was a picture, and when you clicked on it, up came 2 words: lust, with a definition of a strong sexual desire, and then love, an intense feeling of affection. And I think he's absolutely right in saying that we do find those things very confusing, and indeed we do confuse them. Love is very often given, as someone else said, at the expense of ourselves, whereas lust often gets at the expense of someone else. They are not the same thing, yet they are easily confused in our own hearts. Now, most of us, I think, lead a life which we think will take us to the most pleasurable, fulfilling outcome. Most of us have ideas, pictures in our mind, in our hearts, goals, things we aspire to, things that we wish to have in place in our life, which we're certain, if they were given to us, would actually bring fulfillment. Now, it used to be argued back in the 1970s that there was a line of despair in Western culture, which had to do with the collapse of community. But if you were to read, and it seems to me almost any magazine, newspaper, or indeed most TV programs today, the line of despair that runs through our culture isn't actually about meaning, it is actually about intimacy. It's about the question of loneliness. It's about the question of where do we find real connection. About a year ago or so, it might be a little bit longer, the government completed something called a NatSal survey. Now this is actually something which is unique in the United Kingdom, in the world, in terms of its scope, because it's absolutely huge. But it's one of the largest health surveys in the world. They ask all kinds of questions, and they use the responses from those questions to try to help set health policy. Now, after they concluded the last NatSal survey, I was contacted by some of the broadcasters in this country to say, would you like to speak in response to this? And the reason they were looking for someone like me to speak in response to it is that the survey had thrown up a big anomaly. It was a massively statistical anomaly, and they couldn't understand it since the survey size was somewhere between, I think, 50 to 60,000 people or something like that. It was huge. In the previous NatSal, done 10 years earlier, they did this once every decade, one of the questions they had asked is, do you think adultery is a big deal? And over 3/4 of the British population said, not really, it really doesn't matter. But in the latest NatSal, they asked the same question, and there was a 25% variance. Now, all of a sudden, a majority of people saying, yes, we do think it's a big deal, and actually, no, we don't think it's a good idea. And the question was, why? Why is it that we see this massive swing? What has taken place? And so when I was asked about it, and they said, look, as a member of the faith community, what do you have to say about this? And I suppose really at one level, I only had one thing to say, and it was really quite simple. We are looking for fulfillment and intimacy through relationship. But that's why we're looking for faithfulness in those relationships. A faithful friend is someone who keeps their promises and keeps the confidences that we entrust in someone else. An unfaithful lover is someone who has betrayed them. And if you've ever known that sense of betrayal in your life, you can realize how much it hurts. If someone has ever lied to you, cheated to you, deceived you in some way, did it hurt? The answer is yes. Sometimes we use the metaphorical language of being heartbroken to try to capture some of the enormity of that. And sometimes the emotional enormity of that can be so strong that it even finds a physical expression in ourselves. We are literally broken. We are looking for relationships which are meaningful, because in those we find that we normally experience the greatest amount of pleasure, happiness, fulfillment that we know. So we know, most people know instinctively, it's not so much about how much we're going to accumulate or how many things we may have, as wonderful and distracting as those may be. But we're looking for things which are going to meet that full measure of our human heart. And what I hadn't understood as a non-Christian, when I was on the outside looking in, thinking, what is this all about? Is it hadn't really clicked for me that at the heart of the Christian faith was this living, loving relationship with God, made possible through Jesus Christ. I hadn't understood that. I was approaching it very much as, here are some things I know I shouldn't do, and here are things that I have to do. And the trouble is, the things that I want to do are the things I think I'm going to be told I shouldn't be doing, and the things that I don't want to do, those are the things I'm going to have to do. And the result will either be hypocrisy, I'll have to lead a double life, a public one thinking at one level I'm affirming this, but a secret one in order to find fulfillment, or simply be miserable. And I was convinced that misery was the result. Would be the result. As a matter of fact, just before I became a Christian, I went to a group of my closest friends, there were about 5 of them with me, at the talk that I was attending. This is about, I say, 9 months in, having already come to the conclusion the Christian faith was true. And I remember going up to these 5 friends and saying to saying to them as a group, I think I am going to become a Christian today, and I just need you to know from now on, I won't be enjoying life anymore. And then I went off to find someone to go and talk and pray to. Now, this sort of dilemma of, but aren't there things that you have to do, things that you don't have to do? Isn't that going to kill any shot we have at happiness and pleasure? I think is a very common one. And what I hadn't really understood is the nature of what a real, living, loving relationship looks like. One very well-known Christian theologian asked this question, writing about 70, 80 years ago. He says, suppose a man comes to his wife and says to her, must I kiss you good night each night? Supposing a man comes to his wife and says to her, must I kiss you good night each night? Then, being a philosophical theologian, he speculates, what might she say? And his response is that she will say, unless a spontaneous affection for my person motivates you, your overtures are stripped of moral beauty. Now, personally, I think that she'll simply slack. But, he is philosophically inclined, and therefore he's phrased it. Unless a spontaneous affection for my person motivates you, your overtures are stripped of moral beauty. There is a must and a compulsion in relationship, but it's not that kind of must. It's not that kind of compulsion. It comes and springs from something that you want to do and that you desire to do. In a very short little book written by a Christian writer by the name of John Piper entitled The Dangerous Duty of Delight, the way he phrases it is a bit like this. He says, look, we do things for God because we want to, because we've fallen desperately in love with him, because we want to be with him. He says, but the problem is that people then think that sounds very selfish, very self-centered. So is it selfish? Is it selfish to understand relationship this way? You heard it said in my introduction that I travel to a lot of different countries, and that's a huge privilege I have, and I'm going to have to start, obviously, plant a small rainforest, some kind of carbon offset for all the travel that I have done. When I've been away, I very often stop at the florist at the top of my road, and I will buy my wife a large bunch of flowers, because I know she happens to like them. She likes them a lot. It makes her very happy. So imagine I've been away for a while. She's been looking after my three children. Our three children. Oh my goodness, stop digging. She's been looking after the children. I've been away, and so now I come back, and I've stopped at the forest, and I knock on the door, and I have a large bunch of flowers just off to the right. And she opens the door, and as she opens the door, I bend down, I pick up the flowers, and I go, ta-da! These are for you. And she looks at me and says, why did you buy these? And I say, it was my duty. Now, there is something profoundly deficient in that answer, isn't there? So let's suppose I come back, I buy the flowers, I knock on the door, she opens them, I produce the flowers, ta-da! These are for you. And she takes the flowers and she says, Michael, they're beautiful. You shouldn't have. Why did you? And I say, because I love you. Because I know how much joy this brings you. As a matter of fact, I have arranged a babysitter to come tonight and look after the kids. I'm going to take you out to the favourite place you like eating the most, because there's nothing I would rather do, and there's no one I'd rather be with, and there's no way I'd rather spend my time than to spend it alone with you this evening. Let's suppose I say that to her. She never looks at me and says, what do you mean there's nothing you wouldn't rather do? Why don't you think about me sometimes? You're just so selfish. The reason she doesn't say that, it is the natural, healthy outworking of a living, loving relationship to delight yourself in the other. That is a sign of a healthy, loving relationship, that you get delight from that. It is something which is wonderful. And God, through Christ, invites us into a living, loving relationship with him. There are things that you now want to do and other things that you don't want to do, but it's not simply understood as some kind of massive imposition from within. It springs from that heartfelt desire, and that is what I was struggling to get my heart around. That is why I couldn't understand why, when I became a Christian, why I would not sink into misery. But that's what I know. Even at the point I went and found some Christians, because I was so sure it was true, I can remember even at the point of asking them to pray with me that I may become a Christian, that I was utterly convinced that I was sacrificing on the altar of truth my only shot for happiness in this life. That's what it felt like I was doing. But it was springing from this lack of understanding about the nature of the result of the Christian faith. Now, on your chairs, you actually have a copy of John's Gospel. You can take this home to your room and you can read it at your leisure when you do. And in the evenings, there'll be a series of talks given out of here. So please do have a look at this. Don't worry about it. We've fitted a small tracking and listening device into it, so when you take it home, we can hear what you're saying about us behind those doors. But it's designed for you to be able to read and study. But what I would like to do for you this lunchtime, if I may, is just to have a look at one of the incidences that's recorded in Jesus' life in one of the other Gospels, called Luke, where we get an insight into something of what's happening here. Just an insight. It happens in Luke chapter 7. Where Jesus is invited to dinner at a religious leader's house. And because it's an open house, other people can come, because Jesus is someone who is known, and other people want to come and listen to what he has to say. The doors are open, other people can come in, and into that room comes a prostitute. The reason we know that she's a prostitute is that she's described in the Gospel of Luke as having an alabaster jar hanging around her neck. Now, alabaster jars are porous, they leak. You would fill them with a very expensive type of nard. The heat from your body melts the nard, it falls out through the porous holes, and it perfumes the whole body. It's a basic tool of the trade in a culture where water is scarce, and therefore it is incredibly expensive. It is worth a very large amount of money. And into this setting, this woman comes, and she sits behind Jesus, weeping at the way he has been treated by the host, and lets her tears fall onto his feet. And as she does that, she begins to wipe the dirt off his feet, and she takes this jar, which is the basic tool of her trade, smashes it, and rubs this nard into Jesus' feet. Now, the guy who was watching this happen says to himself, if Jesus were a really holy person, if he was some kind of prophet, he would know what type of person is touching him, and he wouldn't allow it to happen, because it is wrong. Now, he doesn't say that out loud, he just thinks it in his heart. But Jesus knows exactly what he's thinking, and he looks at this guy, whose name is Simon. He says, Simon, I have something to ask you. And this guy says, tell me. Jesus says there were two men who owed a lot of money. One owed, let's say, the equivalent of a month's wages. One owed multiple times of that. And they were both forgiven their debt. Jesus then says, as a result of being forgiven, who will love the most? And this religious leader says, well, I guess the one who was forgiven the most. And Jesus said, you have answered correctly. And then he turns to the woman, and he begins to speak to her. Now, what's interesting with any speech, especially when you're reading it in any text, is what tone it's spoken with. Because there's a difference between greeting someone and saying, hello, and hello, are not the same. Tone makes a huge difference to meanings of words. We all know that. So one of the challenges we have when we're reading anything is, what tone has this been speaking with? But here we have a very good idea, because Jesus is looking at the woman and he's speaking to Simon. And we can be fairly certain he's not yelling or screaming at her. So although he's addressing Simon, he looks at her and he says, Simon, do you see this woman? He says, you gave me no water for my feet. Middle Eastern culture, we tend to wear sandals. Roads that are not paved are covered in all kinds of dirt, especially when animals were the main form of transportation. Things dry up very quickly, they get crushed into dirt and it goes around. Do you sort of understand what I'm saying? And so what you do is when you come to eat at a table, well, there is actually no, the word table doesn't actually appear in that particular story. There are no tables. What you do is you're given water for your feet, you wash your feet, and then you recline. You tuck your feet underneath you, you lean on one arm, all the food is in the middle, and you take food from the centre of the meal with your other hand. Now, the reason why you normally wash your feet before doing this is if your feet are covered in dust, dirt, and dried camel and donkey excrement, and it's hot, and therefore sweaty, and you tuck your feet underneath you and you sit on them, when you stand up, especially if you're a man dressed in white robes, or any robes actually, when you turn around, it can look like you've had an accident. Okay? And things need to be washed. So one of the basic requirements is you allow someone to wash their feet. This happens in every culture of the world. We all have various routines. In this country we have a routine. When you invite someone round for a meal or for a drink, you have a routine. They knock on the door, you open it, and you say, hello. Yes, no, feel free to join in. This is what this is meant to be, interactive. Then you normally say, how are you? Then you say, can I take your coat? Because it's always so cold in this part of the world. And then the last thing you say is,
would you like some tea?
Would you like some tea or would you like a drink? Right? If you knock on a friend's door and they open it, they say, it's you, and walk off. And they don't greet you, they don't shake your hand, they don't take your coat, and they don't offer you a drink, that says something. Jesus looks at this woman and says, Simon, I came to your house, you gave me no water for my feet. He says, you actually gave me nothing. You did not greet me with a kiss. That's how we greet each other in the Middle East. You kiss, normally multiple times. Normally at least 3. 1, 2, 3. I made the mistake of doing this once when I first came to England, forgetting where I was. And in England, we normally only do 2, right? And you don't normally touch cheeks. But I did it in the Middle Eastern style, 1, 2, and then I went back for the third one. Of course, she didn't turn her head, so I kissed her full on the lips. So that her husband turned around. That took some explaining. But the kiss is the handshake. So no greeting is given. No water for the feet. And if Jesus was a guest of honor, they would have anointed his head with oil. And none of this is done. Now, I can't explain to you how serious it is to criticize your host in front of their guests in any Middle Eastern culture. You do not do it. So Jesus is actually saying something very serious, but he's also saying it very gently. He's saying, Simon, you didn't kiss me, give me no water for my feet, and you didn't anoint my head with oil. This woman wet my feet with her tears when she saw how you treated me. She's dried them with her hair, and she has taken this very expensive perfume, and she dare not anoint his head, but she puts it onto his feet instead. And then he says, and it's important here that, well, everyone here will understand the importance of grammar, but the text is actually very clear. It's in the past tense. He says, she has loved much, for her many sins, her sins which were many, have been forgiven. It's in the past tense. It's perfect. This woman has already heard Jesus come and speak and say something. Whatever she understands, and however imperfectly, she understands that it's to do with forgiveness of sins. We were saying earlier that in our pursuit for pleasure, we look for relationships, and the thing which breaks our relationships is our unfaithfulness when we do things which are wrong. The thing which restores relationships is forgiveness. If two friends fall out, that doesn't mean they can never be friends again. Friendship is recoverable, so long as forgiveness is on the table. If forgiveness is not on the table, the friendship is gone. And she has understood, however imperfectly, that her sins have broken relationship with God. And whoever Christ is, in some way, he's going to make it possible for the forgiveness of sins to be possible. And in some way, she's cried out for it. Otherwise, Jesus' sentence, your sins which are many have been forgiven in the past tense, doesn't make sense. She's sorry for what she's done. She knows it's wrong, and she knows she needs to be forgiven. He then turns to her and repeats it to her in the present tense. Your sins are forgiven, as a form of reassurance, and then says, go in peace, your faith has saved you. Your trust in me has saved you. We are all in this world living a life which we believe leads to fulfillment, happiness, peace, that will bring pleasure, joy, and rejoicing. We are often pursuing things which, far from fulfilling us, are actually breaking us. And we live in a very broken world, and most of us in this room have experienced that to varying degrees of intensity. We live in a world where we're looking for peace and reconciliation, and we wonder how it might be possible. Not just between nations or different groups who might be at war with each other, but even between us and our families, and even within ourselves. Christ came into this world to offer a message of reconciliation. Now, in the evenings, and I urge you to come, if you haven't already made the decision to come to the evening talks, and listen to what's being said there. There, very well and very clearly, you'll have explained to you who Christ is as the Son of God, why he came into this world, in order to make that forgiveness possible through his willingness to go to the cross and pay for what we have done, and offer us through his resurrection peace, forgiveness, reconciliation with God. And it brings a joy and a fulfillment we cannot know. To become a Christian does not mean all of your problems go away. It does not mean that life becomes easy. As a matter of fact, it may become harder. It doesn't mean that every waking moment is filled with joy as if you've suddenly been promoted to the job of village idiot. That's not what it looks like. It is about a joy and a peace that you can know through the toughest times and the greatest trials that God has won and actually offered as a gift. And the question is, have you ever received it? Now, in a little while, we're going to have the opportunity for questions, and you're going to see there are some cards here, with which you can write down your questions, and we'll take a few. But as you sit here this lunchtime, I'm wondering if I could ask you a question, or a couple of questions first. What is it that you are pursuing, that you believe will ultimately bring this completeness to your own existence? If you have never considered the Christian faith, or you've written off because you think it's designed somehow to remove life from you, I would urge you, come to the evening, come to what's called the search, these meetings on Monday, Tuesday. Find out what the Christian faith is really about. If you're interested in finding out more, if you fill out the card and you tick the box that says, I want to hear about future events, you will be kept informed. Now, in the evenings, there'll be a series of talks out of the Gospel of John. But maybe you'd like to sit down and read this on your own, but maybe you'd like to sit down with someone who's already read it and has some understanding of it so you can talk about it. Well, if you would like to do that, then students who are here at this university are very happy to meet with you, probably people in your college meeting with you, whichever college you happen to be at. And if you would like to do that, and you think that may be helpful, again, if you leave a way of being contacted and you tick that, someone will get in contact with you, and then just arrange that at your convenience. So you can actually read one of the biographies of Jesus' life for yourself and make up your own mind. Is it true? Is it real? What difference can this possibly make? It is possible that for some of you, you've been thinking about the Christian faith for a while. Maybe you have Christian friends, or there's something there, or you've been involved in a conversation. But as you are sat here, it is almost as if God himself has leaned into this room and just placed his hand on your own heart and mind, and you know this is true. That's not the question. And you're sure it is real. You're sure who both Christ is and why he came. You have some understanding of what's happened on the cross. And you know that the thing you need to say to him is to ask for his forgiveness. Well, if that is you, then in the quietness of your heart, I will invite you. Come before him. The way you receive anyone's offer of forgiveness is by saying sorry. I've got a friend of mine who's just sat around the corner over to the left here. I'll pick on him because he can take it, called Richard Cunningham. But let's suppose at the end of this lunchtime talk, I say, I'll take a few questions. And Richard decides he'd like to ask me a question. And after he's finished asking this question, I say, Richard, that's a stupid question. You have the intellectual capacity more commonly associated with forms of pond life invisible to the naked eye. And supposing I respond to him in that way, and for some reason he feels that's insulting. Well, let's supposing, having heard me insult and belittle someone from the platform, that you come back here tomorrow or just a treat to see where this could go, because this could get entertaining. You now come back not to listen to the talk, but you're filming it on your camera just in case you have something that you could post up on the internet a little bit later and have a good laugh about. And I'm here on my own just before, and you're here a little bit early because you want to be on the front row to make sure you get a good shot. And you just say to me, by the way, how's everything between you and Richard? And I look at you, and tears come into my eyes, and I say, he's the closest friend I have. There's no one I'm closer to in the world than him right now. Now, if that was my response to your question, you would conclude that I'll have to have the emotional intelligence of a carrot to conclude that that was true. But let's supposing that after everyone left here, Richard came up quietly to me and said, is there any way we can have a cup of coffee? And as we talk during the afternoon, it spills over into the evening, and in the early hours of the morning, as it becomes very clear that he's been very gracious and very kind to me, that I break down in tears and I say, Richard, I have no idea where I made those things up about you, and I can't believe I talked to you that way. I'm so sorry. At that point, when I say sorry, I receive the forgiveness that Richard is willing to extend to me. And when you come to me the next day and you say, how's everything with Richard? And I say to you, he's the person I feel closest to in the world right now, that may be the complete, total, and utter truth. In Christ, God extends to us an offer of forgiveness for those things which we have done wrong in our life that separate us from him. If you're prepared to say sorry because of who he is and what he's achieved through the cross, you can know that forgiveness and you can be sure of it. Not because of anything great in you, just like there's nothing great about that story about me, but because of the person you can be sure of is offering you that forgiveness and that reconciliation. And if that is where you are, then please leave a way to be contacted and count me in. And what you're saying now is, God, this forgiveness I need to receive from you.
Okay, I think we get to start with the question and answer. Should we please have our first question up on the screen? Okay, I'll read that out. Please can't read it. Early Christians didn't have much of a Bible, yet had a relationship with God. I find it hard to believe God would essentially cease communication upon completion of the Bible. What modes of communication are we missing?
Well, that's a very fair question, and I don't think to talk about God ceasing communicating is helpful at all, in the sense of, yes, it is true that God speaks, I think, very strongly through his word to us, and for the last couple of millennia, Christians have known and understood that. There is also a sense, in terms of any relationship with anyone, of communication with him. I think, as a matter of fact, it's quite interesting. I'm dealing with a situation right now in our own organisation where there have been two very strong miscommunications. One thing was said and it's been taken in two very different ways. And so one of the things that all Christians have always done is, even when they're in that sense of praying with God and listening and waiting on him, of coming back and saying, well, look, let me just make sure that what I think I'm actually hearing at this point is actually consistent with what is in here. So there is some kind of test. I think God does speak in through other ways too, which is why if you were to talk to any of the Christians who are scientists who I know here at this university, they would say that they feel that God both speaks and reveals himself through the creation which we see, as well as hearing, giving guidance and help from other Christians and people around them. So I think that you're right. If your question is, are there other ways in which we have communication with God, then yes, that's a great question. But the primary way in which he always communicates this to us is through here, which is why you're going to hear, if you do keep coming back, an encouragement to pick up this Gospel of John and to read it. Because hopefully through it you will both hear and recognize something which is true and also life-changing. Is that it? Can I go home now? This is great. Can I just say, if you would prefer to write your question down and have someone come and talk to you, if you do write your question out, I think within 24 hours or less, someone will get in contact with you and say, would you like to have a copy to talk about your question. There's also the option, if you want to give any kind of feedback in the back of this note. And I should have said at the end of my presentation that if you do that, then as you leave, you can just hand it in there, and either the comment will be read or the question noted. But how are we doing for questions?
Next question. What is God's idea of pleasure?
It's very interesting. The reason why I'm smiling at that question, it's the difference between asking the question, what is love? Which is a challenging question to come up with a succinct answer. And where might I find and experience love? Which is actually slightly different. But it's no less meaningful in the sense, even though we can't maybe give an exhaustive definition to answer number one. I can tell you what I thought God's idea of pleasure was. Before I was a Christian, my thought of what pleasure with God looked like basically involved a lot of stoicism, eating vegetables. Most people suffer with the image of going to heaven, sitting on a cloud, playing a harp. I'm not particularly fond of the harp. I love orchestral music. My wife leads a cello section in an orchestra. Harp just never really has done it for me. And the idea of playing a harp for eternity, those things are very complicated with all those pedals and strings. Maybe you need forever just to learn how to play one. I'm not sure. But whatever it wasn't appealing. What is interesting is the descriptions you get from God himself, where he says, at my right hand there is pleasure forevermore, which is interesting. And I think the pleasure that comes out from God is in terms of that relationship. And if you've never been in a deep relationship with someone else, it may be hard to give a human analogy. A friend of mine and I were walking through a park up here in North Oxford where they have miniature steam engines. And as we were walking, we saw these three old guys with white beards, white hair. All three would have made the perfect Father Christmas. Any one of them could have auditioned. They were trying to fix one of these miniature steam trains so kids could have a ride being towed around the park by it. And they were laughing and joking. And my colleague, my friend who was with me, said that's the way we used to do community before we all got on the internet. And there was something in that picture of a relational joy and fulfillment that in a very, very small way may capture or describe what it is to enjoy pleasure with God. There is a huge freedom, even in relationship, of knowing forgiveness. I was with a friend recently, we were overseas together, He led a duplicitous life, very successfully for a very, very long period of time. And he had everything that he ever dreamed of. For his wife, his mistresses, his next door neighbour was a guy called Will Smith, who's an actor. His business was going well. I mean, everything seemed to be going well for him. And he looked at me and I said, well, what difference has it made for you becoming a Christian, having left that and now doing something very different? And he picked out his phone and handed it to me. And he says, you can look at anything on my phone and feel free to access any of my browser history. He says, there is nothing in my life now which I need to hide. Everything is different for me. And there is a freedom and a pleasure that comes in being set free from things that may at times hold us so strongly captive, and also knowing an acceptance and an intimacy in your life from someone who knows you completely and yet still loves you and values you and walks with you. So it is, I think, has to be understood in those terms, and it makes so many other things pleasurable. I mean, this is just a personal note, and I don't think it has any profound theological significance, but before I became a Christian, I hated poetry, I hated novels, and I hated grammar. And much to my family's amazement, after I became a Christian, I fell in love with literature, I fell in love with language, I fell in love with grammar and poetry and books. I still wasn't any good at them, the science was still my thing, but somehow I began to find appreciation and pleasure in things that I'd never actually enjoyed before, and I'm pretty certain it's because of the change that had happened in me. Do you want to wrap it up there? Do you want one more? Why doesn't God make himself more evident? You know, I think that is a wonderful question to ask my very good friend Richard Cunningham, who sat to my left over here. I understand the force of the question, because I think there's a huge legitimacy to it. But if I could maybe phrase it around the other way, what is the evidence that God has already given us? Now, I was talking with someone recently, and they said, look, in the absence of evidence, I can't believe anything. So I said, well, various people have written books on this. Have you read any of them? He said, no, I don't need to. And it reminded me of an interview I saw on BBC where a very famous atheist in this country was being questioned. And they said to him, why haven't you, he says, you've come under criticism for failing to respond to any of Professor Alistair McGrath's books in which he tries to talk about the evidence for God and for the Christian faith. And the guy said, I don't need to read them because it's a faith. So clearly there's nothing in those books to be considered. Now, I have to be very careful here. There is a difference between not knowing something, we're coming into a form of agnosticism, and being sure it isn't there when it comes to God, which is a form of atheism. Now, I know we like the Greek word agnostic. We don't use the Latin equivalent, ignoramus, because it has other connotations that most of us in a city like this would want to distance ourselves from. If we don't know, the question is, what can we find out? So the simplest way I want to answer that question, if I could for you, is I actually think there is a lot of evidence to consider, and there is a lot of revelation from God, both through his word, through his creation, most importantly through his Son, through the historical fact around Christ's life, death, and resurrection. And if you've never looked into that, why not go along to the cafe that's being run Monday, Tuesday, the search, and so on, where you can do that. And even if you don't want to buy a book, because you get all of your books for free from the library if you're refusing to buy them yourself while you're here. I hope that goes well with you if that's your course of study, your plan of action. I will give you one or two, some of them written by professors here at this university who are believers who think there is a lot of evidence to consider and that God actually has and can and does make himself evident, that we may know him and put our trust in him. And I'll be delighted to put those in your hands. Well, you've all listened incredibly well. You've been very, very kind. Some of you are even smiling at this point. I know that's because you know with relief that this is about to come to an end. I've enjoyed it, even if you haven't. I look forward to seeing you tomorrow, for those of you who can bear it. And please, if you would like to stay around and talk, I can stay around for a few minutes after this. I'm happy to talk to you. There are various reps who are here. Just stand up if you're happy to have someone come and ask you difficult questions about the Christian faith yourself, because you are a Christian. Okay, all right, well, look, go and find any of those people who are standing up, if there are a few, and go and bother them. If they can't answer your question, go and find someone else who then if you could take the name of the person who failed to answer your question and feed it back, then we will feed that feedback to them, and we'll go through like a quality improvement exercise. By Friday, it will be perfect. Right, thank you so much. And say, please do come and talk. And if you have filled out the full card, if you are wanting to say, count me in, if you're wanting to sit and read the Gospel of Johnson so you can talk about everything, if you have a question that you would much rather talk through, that makes sense, rather than just write down so you can go backwards and forwards, do fill that out, come and drop it off, just make it clear what you want. We will try and meet with you over the next 24 hours so we can get through as many of those questions as you can. Do come tonight, you'll enjoy it. The guy who's speaking in the evenings is way better than I am. This is just a warm-up act for the main thing that we have in the evening. So good to see you.